You've been rehearsing this landing in your head for 3 long years at sea. You've endured storms, war, and hunger, all for this moment, to reunite with your family in the new world. But as your boat hits the sand of Roanoke Island, there is no cheering crowd, no smoke from the chimneys, just a deafening, unnatural silence. Near the shoreline, someone spots letters carved into a tree, C-R-O. It's not an explanation, just a fragment, like the start of a sentence that never got finished. John White keeps walking, heart pounding, deeper toward the settlement, and what he finds is worse. The place is still standing, but it's been stripped and abandoned, like people packed up in a hurry without setting anything on fire. 117 men, women, and children, including his own granddaughter, are simply gone. No bodies, no clear signs of a struggle, no final note that tells you why. Only one word carved into a post of the wooden palisade: CROATOAN. For 4 centuries, this has been called America's oldest mystery, a tale of ghosts, massacres, and a vanished colony. But what if the truth isn't hidden in a curse? What if it's hiding in a cold, practical trail of clues that history nearly erased? Today, we aren't just retelling a legend. We are solving a 400-year-old cold case. And before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where you are joining us from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to read through the comments and see how far these stories travel across the world, so let me know below. It's late summer, August 1590, and a small English ship feels its way toward Roanoke Island with a man on deck who has been carrying this return in his chest for 3 long years. John White is coming back to the colony he helped plant, back to the people he left behind, including his own daughter and his little granddaughter, a child who was barely more than a newborn when he sailed away. He's not expecting comfort, but he is expecting life. Smoke from cooking fires, voices drifting through trees, the simple noise of a place that still has people in it. As they get close to shore, the silence hits first, the kind that makes you listen harder, like your ears are trying to catch up to what your eyes don't want to accept. They land, they move along the edge of the island, and almost immediately there's a strange detail that stops them: carved letters on a tree near the waterline. Just 3 letters, C-R-O, not a full word, not an explanation, but enough to feel like someone reached out from the past and left a fragment. It's a small thing, and that's what makes it worse, because it tells you something happened here, and you're only seeing the beginning of the message. White keeps going, pushing inland toward the settlement itself, and with every step, the absence becomes louder. No fresh tracks, no people running to greet them, no sign of a watch. When the outlines of the colony finally appear, what they find isn't a scene of obvious disaster. It's a place that looks like it was taken apart more than destroyed. The structures still have a shape, the palisade still stands, but the life inside it is gone. And then the fragment from the tree suddenly makes sense. On a post of the palisade, cut clearly into the wood, is the full word, CROATOAN. Not a prayer, not a threat, not a confession, just a name, steady and plain. Before White left, he had arranged a simple system, a way for the colonists to tell him what happened if they ever had to move. If they left under immediate threat, they were supposed to carve a cross as well. There's no cross, there's only that destination, first hinted at in a half-said warning by the shore, then stated outright at the heart of the empty settlement. 117 men, women, and children had been here. Now there's weathered timber, wind moving through grass, and a word that points away from Roanoke, as if whoever carved it believed it would be understood. And that's the hook that still holds, not just that they're gone, but that they may have left with purpose, carrying what they could, stepping into a world where an English colony could survive only by becoming something else. Long before anyone carved CROATOAN into wood, Roanoke had already been bruised by a first experiment that was never as stable as it sounded in London. In 1585, the English presence on the island wasn't a community trying to put down roots. It was closer to a military foothold. Men under Ralph Lane, armed, tense, and living inside a plan that assumed the ocean behind them would stay open and friendly. On paper, Raleigh's dream looked efficient: a base on the Atlantic coast, a place to resupply ships, a stepping stone for trade and power. On the ground, it turned into a daily struggle over food, trust, and time. The English arrived late in the season, they didn't know the land, and they quickly learned a hard fact that shaped everything that followed: they could not feed themselves without local help. They didn't have deep experience with the basics that mattered here: how to work with the rhythms of local waters, how to fish the way coastal communities fished, how to grow and process corn the way people in the region had done for generations, how to store food through heat and storms. In a place like this, ignorance isn't just inconvenience, it's hunger, and hunger changes people fast. It makes small misunderstandings feel like threats. It makes every negotiation sharper. It makes men with weapons start seeing those weapons as solutions. The local communities the English encountered, often described in the English record under names like CROATOAN, had their own politics and rivalries, their own reasons to be cautious. At first, there were exchanges and meetings that could be read as hopeful, but the relationship was sitting on a trap door because the English wanted steady deliveries of food and information, and the people they were pressuring had their own families to feed and their own limits on patience. Then comes the kind of incident that historians can explain in terms of diplomatic breakdown, but that is easier to grasp as a picture. An English silver cup goes missing. In the story, as it's often told, the colonists suspect a nearby village, and that suspicion becomes an excuse. The English respond by attacking and burning the village at Akaskogok. A dispute over a small object turns into a brutal act that broadcasts a much larger message. These strangers will punish, and they will punish hard. Once that happens, every future exchange is poisoned. Even if some people still want trade, they now understand the cost of being blamed. And from the English side, the fear spirals too. They are outnumbered, far from home, dependent on a supply chain that could fail at any moment, and now they have made themselves less welcome in the very place they need. This is where the mathematics of survival becomes the real engine of the story. You can talk about empire and strategy, but on Roanoke the questions were simpler and meaner. How many mouths? How much food? How many days until the next ship? How many storms until the next harvest? How many mistakes before someone dies? The colonists didn't just want food, they needed predictable food, and they didn't have a reliable way to produce it. So they leaned harder on trade, and when trade didn't bend to their timetable, they leaned on force. Tension didn't stay abstract. It seeped into patrols, into rumors, into sleepless nights, into the way every unfamiliar movement in the trees could be read as a threat. By 1586, the outpost is fraying. Hunger, illness, and constant pressure wear the men down. Lane's group is trapped in that same brutal equation. They need local support to survive, but their own actions are making local support less likely. And then something happens that changes the story's pace in an instant, like a rescue line dropping out of the sky. Francis Drake appears off the coast. He isn't there because Roanoke is his mission. He has been raiding Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic, moving with the momentum of a private war, and Roanoke becomes an unexpected stop in the wake of those attacks. For the starving soldiers on the island, his arrival feels like a miracle, the sudden appearance of ships, supplies, and a way out. It's the effect Drake in the rawest form. One famous sailor's chance visit becomes the difference between a desperate outpost grinding itself into the ground and an evacuation that happens before the situation turns fatal. Lane's men take the opportunity and leave with Drake, abandoning the idea of holding Roanoke as a permanent foothold. Some supplies and a small presence are later left behind again in the churn of follow-up voyages, but the first attempt never recovers its footing. What it leaves behind is more than empty buildings. It leaves behind a reputation. It teaches local communities that English arrivals can bring violence and instability. It teaches the English that the land will not feed them unless they learn it or earn trust, and they don't have the time or humility to do either properly. So when the 1587 colonists arrive, families, children, a newborn baby, it isn't a clean new beginning. It's a second act built on a foundation that was already cracked by hunger, fear, and that small, unforgettable image of a silver cup turning into a burning village. This time, the ship didn't bring a garrison looking for a fight. It brought people looking for a future, and you can feel the difference in the very idea of the voyage. In 1587, the plan shifts from a rough military foothold to something that sounds more permanent. Families, tradespeople, laborers, a community that's supposed to live off the land and slowly grow into a stable English presence. Some of the names we have are just names on a list, but behind each one is a choice that's easy to underestimate today. Crossing the Atlantic wasn't a long vacation, it was a calculated risk with terrible odds. People went because they wanted land they could never afford in England, because they wanted work, because they were promised status or opportunity, because they were attached to Raleigh's network, or because the world they came from was already hard and crowded and offered them very little. And the moment they arrive, reality starts pressing in, as it always does. They are not stepping into an empty wilderness. They are arriving on an island that has already seen conflict, and that memory doesn't disappear just because you bring children and wedding rings. John White, the governor of this new colony, is not a soldier in the classic sense. He's an artist and a map maker, someone who had been in the region before, someone who can observe and record, and that matters because so much of what we know comes through people like him. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, is there too, pregnant, and her presence turns the colony into something more than an outpost. It becomes a place where births happen, where you imagine a next generation. When Eleanor gives birth soon after arriving, to a baby girl named Virginia Dare, it lands like a symbol, whether anyone asked for a symbol or not. In English memory, she becomes the first English child born in the Americas, and that phrase has a kind of shine to it. But even if you strip away the later legend, the basic fact still matters. There is now an infant in this settlement. There are mothers and fathers. There are people who can't simply pick up a musket and march away. The stakes become immediate and human. The first weeks would have been a blur of work that leaves no room for romance, clearing ground, repairing structures left from earlier attempts, building shelter that can handle storms, figuring out where fresh water is reliable, learning what grows and what doesn't, and trying to rebuild relationships with local communities that have every reason to doubt English promises. And the colony arrives with an additional complication that doesn't get enough attention in the popular telling. They were not even supposed to be on Roanoke in the first place. The original instructions pointed toward the Chesapeake Bay area, farther north, a location many English planners thought would be better for a permanent settlement. But navigation, decisions by the captain, and perhaps impatience or calculation pushed them back to Roanoke. That matters because it means the colonists begin their new start by planting themselves in a place already associated with earlier failure and violence. From the beginning, the 1587 group is trying to turn a damaged foundation into a home. The emotional tone is complicated. You can have hope and fear in the same hour. You can celebrate a birth and then look at the pantry and do the grim arithmetic of how many mouths you have to feed. You can tell yourself the next ship is coming because you have to believe that, and then lie awake at night listening to the weather and realizing how thin your margin is. We have hints of that tension in the way the colony behaves. Not long after arriving, there's an effort to reconnect with friendly groups and to manage hostile ones. There's an attempt to retrieve or stabilize what was left behind from the earlier garrison. There are meetings, misunderstandings, and the constant problem of food. On an exposed barrier island, you can fish, you can gather, you can hunt, and you can plant, but you need local knowledge, good timing, and good relations to make it work, especially with a population this size. The English are also carrying expectations that don't match the environment. Many of them are not experienced farmers in the kind of conditions they face here. Some are craftsmen whose skills matter later, once a settlement is stable, but stability is exactly what they don't have yet. Their supply situation is shaky almost immediately. They have what they brought, they have what they can trade for, and they have what they can produce fast. Anything beyond that depends on ships returning from England, and those ships are never guaranteed. John White is at the center of the problem in a way that feels painfully personal. He's the governor, responsible for the entire community, and he's also a father and a grandfather. If the colony struggles, it isn't an abstract policy failure, it's his family facing hunger. As the weeks pass, pressure builds from multiple directions at once. Relations with local people are uneven, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, and always shaped by earlier betrayals. The colonists are trying to read a landscape they don't fully understand. Storms can damage crops and structures. Disease can spread in cramped conditions. And then there's the psychological weight of being on the edge of the known world, at least as these settlers understood it, where every mistake is amplified because help is so far away. At some point, the community reaches a decision that is both logical and heartbreaking. White must go back to England to get supplies and reinforcements. It's the kind of decision leaders in fragile settlements make all the time, and it always sounds clean in retrospect, as if you simply send someone for help and then wait. But in real life, sending your governor away is also admitting you're close to the line. It's saying we can't make it on what we have. It's asking the remaining people to hold together through another winter, another season, another unpredictable stretch of days. And for White, it means leaving Eleanor and Virginia behind, trusting that the colony can survive without him for long enough that he can return. The last time English settlers left Roanoke, they left because they were desperate. Now White is leaving because everyone is trying not to become desperate, trying to catch the problem before it turns into collapse. The tragedy is that the choice is sensible, and still, it sets the stage for everything that follows. When he sails away, the colony becomes a closed room with a ticking clock, full of families who have bet their lives on a supply line that runs across an ocean. John White's departure from Roanoke is often told like a simple errand, as if he sailed home, asked for help, and then got delayed by bad luck. But the delay wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a complete break in the system the colony depended on. White leaves with a plan in his mind that sounds reasonable: get to England, gather supplies, recruit more settlers, and return as quickly as possible. He is not thinking in years, he is thinking in weeks, maybe a few months. He's thinking like someone who has watched food stores shrink and has heard the brittle edge in people's voices when they talk about the next harvest. And then he runs straight into the reality of Europe at war. By the late 1580s, England is locked in a conflict with Spain that is not just political, but existential in the way people at the time understood it, a struggle of power, religion, and survival of the regime. English ships are being armed, redirected, inspected, seized for defense, and pressed into service. Ports are tense places. Sailors are pulled into military plans. Private vessels are turned into war assets. The most famous symbol of this moment is the Spanish Armada, the massive fleet Spain sends in 1588. But the larger truth is that a whole maritime world gets reshuffled around the expectation of invasion and battle. When a country believes an enemy fleet is coming, it doesn't treat colonial resupply as a priority. White is suddenly a man with an urgent personal mission, trapped inside a national emergency that does not care about his urgency. There's a cruel irony in how it plays out. Roanoke was imagined partly as a strategic asset, a base that could support English power in the Atlantic. Yet when England's survival feels at stake, the colony becomes a distant footnote. White tries to get ships. He tries to persuade backers. He gets permission for small vessels at one point, and then those attempts collapse into the chaos of the sea itself. In one case, the ships he finally obtains are attacked by privateers, and the effort limps back to England damaged and robbed. It's the kind of episode that sounds like adventure when you read it quickly, but for White, it is a widening pit in the ground. Every failed departure isn't just a setback, it's another season his daughter and granddaughter are living without the supplies he promised he would bring. And the hardest part is that he can't know day to day what is happening on Roanoke. There are no letters, no messengers, no reliable rumors, just an ocean and a silence that stretches on. So 3 years pass, and that number can sound abstract until you slow down and live inside it for a minute. 3 years is 3 winters, 3 planting seasons, 3 cycles of sickness, storms, and hunger. 3 years for a child to go from a newborn to a toddler who might not even recognize the man everyone is waiting for. It's also long enough for a community to change shape completely. People adapt, people fight, people make plans, people give up on plans. If the colony had been a group of soldiers, you might imagine discipline holding for a time. But these are families, and families don't run on orders alone. They run on food, trust, and shared belief that the future is still possible. During those years, what could the colonists have been doing? We don't have a diary that carries us through each month, so we have to reason from what we know about similar situations, and we have to be careful not to pretend speculation is certainty. Still, some pressures are obvious. Food would remain the central problem. The supplies they brought in 1587 would be long gone or ruined. Any ammunition and tools would be precious. They would need to rely heavily on fishing, hunting, and whatever they could grow, and that means learning quickly, because mistakes cost lives. They would need to rebuild relationships with neighboring communities, or at least avoid provoking them. They might be forced to trade more, to move more, to send small groups out to explore safer ground. And the island itself is a hard place to anchor your hope. Barrier islands shift. Storms cut new inlets. Salt water can creep into fresh water sources. Crops can fail. If you're trying to keep children alive, you start looking for stability anywhere you can find it, even if that means leaving the spot you first claimed. In that context, the idea of relocation stops sounding dramatic and starts sounding practical. White did leave them a plan for communication, a simple code. If they moved, they should carve the name of the destination. If they moved under threat, they should add a cross. That's a small detail, but it's one of the few pieces of structure we can hold on to, because it suggests the colonists already understood that staying put might not be possible. It's also a reminder that their world was not a blank map. There were known places, known allies, known dangers, and names that mattered. The word CROATOAN would have meant something concrete to them, not a riddle. It pointed toward people and places they had encountered before. And then there's another reality that makes the silence heavier. The longer White is gone, the more the colonists must adjust their expectations. In the first months, they may have waited with a kind of disciplined patience, scanning the horizon, keeping a lookout, telling themselves relief is coming. After a year, that kind of waiting turns into a burden. After 2 years, it starts to look like self-destruction. At some point, the community would have to decide whether holding on meant staying in the same location or doing whatever it takes to remain alive. We tend to imagine loyalty as staying where you were planted, but survival often demands movement. It demands blending, bargaining, and compromise. White in England is stuck watching history unfold at a scale that makes his personal crisis invisible. The colonists in America are stuck living history at the scale of daily hunger. And between those two realities, the supply line snaps. When White finally does return in 1590, he isn't arriving to a colony that has simply been waiting. He's arriving to a place that has had 3 years to solve its problems without him, and whatever solution they found, it left the settlement empty. People love a clean mystery, and when history refuses to give you a clean answer, the imagination rushes in to finish the job. Roanoke is a perfect example of that. An empty settlement, a single word carved in wood, and then silence. If you want a ghost story, it practically writes itself. Over the years, you get the usual lineup: a curse on the land, a mass slaughter so total it erased every trace, secret tunnels, secret pirates, secret anything. In more modern versions, you even get aliens because "they vanished" is the kind of phrase that invites the weirdest possible completion. But if you step back and treat Roanoke like a real place where real people lived and made hard choices, most of the supernatural stuff starts to feel less like an explanation and more like a way of coping with uncertainty. The first myth to tackle is the idea of a curse, the notion that the colony was doomed by fate or by some mystical force tied to the island. It's a tempting thought because it lets you skip the uncomfortable parts: hunger, disease, violence, and the reality that Europeans were entering a world they didn't understand and often refused to respect. A curse is neat. Human failure is messy. But when you look at the practical conditions, thin supplies, an exposed island, a damaged relationship with nearby communities, a leader forced away for years, the simpler explanation is that the colony was living on a razor's edge, and razor edges don't need magic to cut. Then there's the massacre theory, which is probably the most common serious answer people reach for, because it fits a certain expectation. Conflict happened, therefore the settlers must have been wiped out. And to be fair, there were real tensions and real violence in the region. Nobody has to invent danger. The question is whether a massacre at the settlement is consistent with what was found. White's party did not describe burned ruins, scattered weapons, or obvious battle damage. They found an abandoned place, not a destroyed one. Now, you have to be careful here, because absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Coastal environments can swallow traces. Wood rots, sand moves. Bones can be scattered by animals, buried by storms, or dissolved in acidic soil. Even so, a large, sudden slaughter of more than 100 people at one site usually leaves something behind: disturbed ground, broken defensive structures, signs of hurried flight, concentrated remains, a pattern you can argue with. Roanoke scene, as described, reads differently. It reads like departure, like dismantling, like a settlement that stopped being a settlement. And that matters because it shifts the basic question from who killed them to where did they go, and why did they decide leaving was safer than staying. Another popular idea is the vanished overnight version, as if the colony was there one day and gone the next, with meals still on the table. That's not what the evidence suggests. If people planned to move, they would take useful materials with them. They would strip iron fittings, they might pull up planks, they would carry tools, weapons, and anything that could be traded. A clean disappearance can actually be a sign of a deliberate relocation, not a magical one. When you're trying to survive, you don't leave valuable items lying around for the next visitor out of politeness. You take what keeps you alive. There's also the pirate theory, which has a certain romantic charm. Roving sea raiders scoop up the colonists and vanish into the Atlantic fog. The problem is scale and logistics. Moving a whole community, men, women, children, by force across shallow waters without leaving a strong trail is not easy. Pirates, privateers, and opportunistic raiders absolutely operated in those waters at times, but there's a big difference between attacking a ship and relocating a population. The pirate story is cinematic, but it struggles to fit the plain clue the colonists left behind. If you're kidnapped, you don't usually get to calmly carve a destination into a post according to a prearranged plan. The secret Spanish attack version comes up too, because Spain and England were rivals, and because Spanish forces had reasons to view English settlements as threats. The trouble is that while Spanish activity in the broader region is real, pinning Roanoke's disappearance on a covert strike requires more than general hostility. You would want Spanish documentation, survivor accounts, or physical evidence that points to an assault. What survives doesn't give us that. It doesn't rule out violence at some point in the colony's story, but it doesn't cleanly support the idea of a decisive final attack that erased everyone at Roanoke itself. And then we have the truly supernatural or speculative modern claims: aliens, portals, time slips, you name it. Those theories usually rely on the same move: take the lack of a detailed record and treat it as proof that something impossible happened. But history is full of missing records. Most people in the past did not leave diaries. Most documents were lost to fire, water, insects, war, and simple neglect. The mystery is not proof of the paranormal. It's proof that the archival trail is thin and that later generations desperately wanted it to be thick. In fact, part of what makes Roanoke famous is not just what happened in the 1580s, but what people did with the story afterward. In the centuries that followed, writers, promoters, and storytellers kept returning to Roanoke because it offered a blank space where they could paint almost anything. By the 19th century especially, there was a hunger for origin stories, for tales that turned early colonization into legend, sometimes tragic, sometimes heroic, often sanitized. Roanoke could be framed as a haunting warning, a romantic tragedy, or a moral lesson depending on the taste of the moment. Virginia Dare, a real child whose later life is undocumented, becomes a canvas for invented fates, transformed into an indigenous princess, cursed into an animal, hidden away in secret communities, raised as a symbol of the lost innocence of English America. None of that is solid history. It's storytelling filling a vacuum, and it tells you more about the eras that invented those versions than it does about the 1587 settlers themselves. This is where it helps to be honest about how mysteries work. When you have a dramatic setup and a lack of closure, the story doesn't just sit there quietly. It attracts interpretations like a magnet. And once a sensational idea takes hold, it can be hard to dislodge because it's more fun than the mundane reality that most crises in human history are made of the same ingredients: shortages, fear, misunderstanding, and adaptation. So what can we say with more confidence, without pretending we know everything? We can say the colonists left. That much is strongly suggested by the condition of the site and by the message itself. We can say they expected White might return because they followed the communication plan he set up. We can say the word CROATOAN is not an abstract symbol. It is a place name and an ethnonym associated with people the English had met, and it points toward a specific direction rather than toward the heavens. We can also say that the lack of a distress marker, like the cross White asked for, complicates the idea that they were forced out in a sudden panic from that exact spot. Complicates doesn't mean cancels. Threat can be gradual. People can leave under pressure without carving a cross because they are hoping even then to present their decision as orderly. Or the sign can be incomplete because conditions changed, because the people doing the carving were interrupted, because not everyone agreed, because someone remembered the instruction differently. The point is, the clue we have leans toward planned movement more than toward an annihilating event at the settlement. Another thing we can say is that no bones is not a slam-dunk argument in either direction. If you want to be careful, you treat it as one piece of a larger puzzle. Coastal Carolina is a hard place for fragile evidence to survive. Storms can reshape a shoreline dramatically. Burial practices vary. A population that breaks into smaller groups and moves inland may leave remains scattered across many locations, some of which might never be excavated, some of which might lie under modern development, and some of which might be on protected land where digging is limited. Even if remains exist, identifying them as Roanoke colonists would be difficult without context. So, when someone says, "there were no bodies, therefore it's supernatural," the better response is, no bodies means the site does not show an obvious mass death event, and it also means the physical trace is harder to follow. It's a frustrating answer, but frustration is part of honest history. There's also a subtle trap in the way people talk about the mystery, like it's a magic trick performed on a stage. The colony didn't vanish from the world. The colony vanished from the English record. Those are not the same thing. If the settlers moved and integrated into indigenous communities, their story would still exist, just not in the paperwork of the people who left them behind. It might exist in oral traditions, in family lines, in cultural traces that don't look like neat English paragraphs on a page. It might also exist in silence, because trauma and conflict can erase memory on purpose. People sometimes stop telling stories because the stories hurt, or because telling them becomes dangerous. In that sense, the most realistic mystery version is also the saddest, not a magical disappearance, but a human absorption into a world that did not preserve them as a separate category called the English. And that brings us back to why Roanoke is so easy to romanticize. A supernatural explanation lets you keep the settlers frozen in time as lost, always waiting to be found. A human explanation forces you to imagine them changing, learning new languages, marrying into other communities, adopting new ways to eat, travel, and live, and possibly losing the identity that England assigned them. That's less tidy, and it doesn't give you a single dramatic reveal, but it fits how people survive when their original plan collapses. So if you want to clear the fog without pretending the fog is gone, the best move is to stop asking which monster did it and start asking which pressures would push a small community to pack up their lives, leave a last note behind, and head toward the nearest place they thought they might be able to endure. So let's take the simplest clue seriously and see where it leads when we treat it as a practical message instead of a spooky riddle. CROATOAN was not a random word. It pointed to a real place and real people the English already knew about. In the late 1580s, CROATOAN was associated with Hatteras Island and a community the English had interacted with during earlier voyages. That matters because when you're running out of food, when you're unsure who is friend or enemy, and when you're stuck waiting for ships that never appear, you don't dream up a poetic farewell. You point to a destination that might keep your children alive. And that's why many researchers think the most likely answer is not that the Roanoke colonists vanished, but that they moved, then blended into the local world in ways that English records weren't built to track. The move itself could have been gradual, not a single dramatic march. Think about what 3 years of isolation does to a settlement. At first, you try to stick to the plan: plant, fish, trade, keep the palisade intact, and wait. Then small problems start stacking: a bad harvest, a storm that ruins boats or salt burns crops, illness that takes key workers, a relationship with a nearby group that turns tense. You respond with small adjustments, send hunting parties farther out, move a few people to a better water source, make more trips to trade. Over time, those temporary adjustments can turn into a new reality, especially if the island starts feeling like a trap rather than a home. This is the part that's easy to miss. Leaving Roanoke would not necessarily feel like abandoning the colony. It could feel like saving it. If the goal is stay alive until White returns, then relocating to a safer place is not betrayal. It's strategy. The question becomes, safer where? One option is Hatteras, the CROATOAN destination itself, because it suggests an existing relationship that might allow newcomers to be accepted, at least partially. Another option is inland, where the soil can be better and where you're less exposed to the worst storms. And those options aren't mutually exclusive. The colony could have split. One group might have gone to Hatteras, another might have pushed inland along waterways, and over time those groups might have moved again, following food, politics, and opportunity. People often imagine integration as one simple event, like a handshake, and then everyone lives together happily. Real integration is usually uneven and complicated. Some people may have been welcomed, some tolerated, some exploited, some rejected. Some marriages might have happened. Some individuals might have become adopted into families. Some might have become dependent laborers. Some might have been used as bargaining chips in local rivalries, and some might have died along the way. Integration can include genuine alliance, and it can also include coercion. The word is clean, but the reality can be harsh. Still, when you ask what would be most likely in terms of survival, joining or attaching yourself to established indigenous communities has an obvious advantage. Those communities knew how to farm and fish in that environment. They knew how to move through it. They knew which seasons were dangerous, which plants mattered, which routes were safe, and how to read shifting alliances. The English, by contrast, were outsiders with limited supplies, limited local knowledge, and no reliable backup plan once the ships stopped coming. In survival terms, the invisible solution is not weird at all. It's what people do when their old identity stops feeding them. They adapt, they attach, they become part of something that already works. There are historical hints that point in this direction, though each one has to be handled carefully, because early colonial reports can be biased, second-hand, or shaped by politics. Later English settlers, especially in the Jamestown era, heard stories about people with English features living among local groups, or about indigenous communities with knowledge of English words and practices. Some accounts mention individuals who allegedly had gray eyes or spoke a little English. These reports get repeated a lot because they feel like a breadcrumb trail. The cautious way to treat them as signals, not proof. They suggest that the idea of Europeans being absorbed into indigenous societies was imaginable and maybe observed, but they don't give you a clean list of names and dates. They also sit inside a world where rumor travels fast and can get twisted to serve someone's agenda. Yet even with those limits, the basic scenario remains plausible because we know from many other contexts that captives, refugees, and small groups of outsiders have been incorporated into larger societies throughout history. And in the Americas, European integration into indigenous communities happened in many places, for many reasons, long before it became rare. Archaeology adds another layer, and this is where the story gets both exciting and frustrating. Archaeological evidence rarely gives you a neat headline. It gives you fragments, a piece of pottery, a tool, a bit of metal, something that looks out of place in a given context. On Hatteras Island, archaeologists have found items that appear to be of European origin from around the right period, mixed into sites associated with indigenous settlement. That doesn't automatically mean Roanoke colonists lived here, because European goods could move through trade, salvage, or later contact. But the timing and the location make it hard to ignore. It's consistent with the idea that some kind of sustained contact occurred, and possibly more than just a single trade encounter. There's also the inland angle, the thought that the colonists moved toward the mainland where farming could be more reliable. If you were trying to make a community last, you would be drawn to better soil and more stable fresh water. But here again, the physical record is patchy. Sites get eroded, land gets developed, excavations are limited, and even when something is found, identifying it as specifically tied to the Roanoke group can be difficult. The colonists didn't stamp Roanoke on their tools. A simple iron nail is just a nail unless you can tie it to a context that tells a story. Still, when multiple lines of evidence point in the same direction, place name clue, historical plausibility, scattered archaeological finds, the integration scenario starts to look less like a guess and more like the most reasonable reading of what little we have. It also explains the clean abandonment of the settlement. If the colonists chose to move, they would strip what they could. They might dismantle houses for reusable wood. They would carry iron because iron is wealth in a frontier setting. They would take weapons, tools, and anything that can be traded for food. Over time, their old site would look exactly like what White found, a place with a skeleton of structure, but without the people and without the portable pieces of daily life. And it explains something else: why White didn't find a desperate, detailed message. If you're relocating with hope that you can survive, hope that you might be found later, you don't write a long confession, you leave a pointer, You leave the one thing that matters to someone arriving by boat, the direction you went. The absence of the distress cross is often treated like a decisive detail, as if it proves the colonists were safe and unthreatened. It's better to think of it as a hint, not a guarantee. Threat doesn't always look like an enemy charging the gate. Threat can be hunger. Threat can be the slow tightening of hostility from neighbors. Threat can be fear of a coming attack. Threat can be the realization that you are one storm away from losing your water supply. In that kind of pressure, you might still leave in an organized way without a moment that feels like we are fleeing under direct assault, even if the overall move is driven by danger. Or the message could have been incomplete, or carved by someone who didn't know the full plan, or finished in haste. Human communication under stress is rarely perfect. Now, if this is the most likely solution, why does it feel so unsatisfying to a lot of people? Because it's invisible by design. If the colonists integrated, then the neat English category of the Roanoke colony stops existing. Individuals become part of other families. Children grow up speaking different languages. Names change, clothes change, religion changes. And within a generation or two, you might have descendants who carry some English ancestry but no English identity, because identity follows community, not bloodlines alone. From England's perspective, the colony disappeared. From the perspective of the land itself, people moved, adapted, and kept going. That's the heart of the invisible solution. It doesn't give you a single dramatic ending. It gives you a slow human transformation, and it asks you to accept that survival often looks like disappearing into someone else's world. And if that's what happened, then the mystery isn't only about loss, it's also about endurance, about the quiet decisions families make when the grand plan fails and the only thing left is to keep breathing. For a long time, Roanoke lived mostly in the space between a few lines of text and a lot of imagination, because the paper trail is thin and the ground doesn't always cooperate. But modern research has a different rhythm. It's slower, more technical, and often less satisfying in a dramatic sense because it deals in fragments and probabilities. Still, it can push the story forward in a real way, especially when old artifacts get re-examined with fresh eyes and when new methods are used to test old claims. One of the most intriguing objects in the Roanoke story is a map made by John White himself, a chart of the region that later became known as the Virginea Pars map. At first glance, it looks like what you'd expect from the era: coastlines, inlets, islands, notes, and place names arranged with the mixture of knowledge and uncertainty you'd find on many early maps. But the map has had a second life because it may contain more than it seems. Researchers studying it noticed something unusual: a small patch, like a correction, a piece of paper affixed over part of the original. That's already interesting because it suggests revision, secrecy, or at least a change of mind. When the map was examined with modern imaging techniques, people reported seeing a symbol beneath that patch, a kind of geometric mark that could represent a fort. The reason that matters is simple. If there was a planned or considered fortification inland, away from the exposed island, that lines up with the most practical survival logic we've been circling. Get off the barrier island, move to more stable ground, create a defensible base near fresh water and better soil. Now here's where the careful language matters. The fact is, the map exists, the patch exists, and modern imaging has been used to look under it. The interpretation is what that hidden mark truly signifies. A symbol that resembles a fort could indeed indicate a site white or other English planners thought about, or heard about, or wanted to keep private. It could be something else that happens to look fort-like to modern eyes. Early cartographic symbols were not standardized in the way we're used to. And even if it is a fort symbol, it doesn't automatically mean the lost colonists built it, or they lived there for years. It could reflect intention rather than outcome. It could reflect scouting. It could reflect a plan that never materialized. But it's still a valuable clue because it ties an inland idea to a primary source connected directly to the colony's leadership. It's the kind of hint historians get excited about, not a smoking gun, but a door that might lead somewhere. The British Museum connection comes into play because the map is held there, and institutional conservation and imaging work helped make these under-the-surface details visible and discussable. That's a broader theme with modern historical science. Objects that have sat quietly for centuries can reveal new information when you treat them not just as illustrations, but as layered physical artifacts. Ink sits differently on paper. Repairs leave traces. Pigments reflect light in ways the human eye can't catch. A map can be both a document and a piece of material evidence. In the Roanoke case, that matters because the story is so starved for direct signals from the period. A second line of modern inquiry comes from archaeology, and it's closely related to the map question, because once you suspect an inland movement, you start asking where to dig and what to look for. Archaeology doesn't prove stories in the way people sometimes hope. It builds an argument from context. If you find European-style objects in a clearly dated context that predates later English settlements, that's meaningful. If you find them at the right distance inland, near places that match geographic hints, that's more meaningful. If you find them alongside signs of sustained domestic activity rather than a one-off exchange, that's more meaningful still. But it's hard. The landscape has changed. Shorelines have moved. Rivers shift. Sites get disturbed by storms, agriculture, and development. And even when you find European materials, you have to ask whether they arrived with English settlers, were traded through multiple hands, were scavenged from shipwrecks, or were introduced later and mixed into earlier layers. In coastal North America, objects travel in complicated ways. A single artifact can be exciting, but it rarely stands alone as a conclusion. That's why Roanoke archaeology often feels like a mosaic where many tiles are missing. You can see shapes, but you have to resist pretending the shape is complete. Then there's the modern angle people are most curious about, because it sounds like it should be decisive: DNA. The basic idea is intuitive. If some of the Roanoke colonists survived and had children, and if their descendants stayed in the region, then traces of that ancestry might still exist in local populations. That's the promise that makes headlines, the thought of taking a cheek swab and finally closing a 400-year-old story. The reality is more complicated, but not pointless. DNA research can be helpful, especially when it's framed correctly, because it can test some kinds of claims and challenge others. The key is to understand what DNA can and cannot do in a case like this. The first challenge is reference points. To identify lost colonist markers, you'd ideally want genetic profiles from known Roanoke individuals or their close relatives. But we don't have preserved remains confidently tied to specific members of the colony in a way that would allow clean sampling. And even if remains were found, ethical and legal constraints around excavation and testing, especially involving burial grounds, are serious and appropriate. So instead of direct profiles, projects often work with indirect methods. comparing participants' DNA to broader patterns of British Isles ancestry, looking for segments that might suggest certain lineages, and combining genetic results with documentary genealogy. That can produce interesting signals, but it also means conclusions must be cautious. British Isles ancestry is not unique to Roanoke. Later waves of English, Scottish, and Irish migration into the region would create similar genetic patterns. So even if you find a strong British component in a local family, that doesn't automatically point back to 1587. It could point to 1690, 1740, 1810, or any number of other moments. To make a case for Roanoke specifically, you need more than DNA. In the end, Roanoke refuses to give us the kind of finale people expect, and that's exactly why it has lasted so long in the public imagination. We want a last scene with a clear culprit, a clear tragedy, a clear hero, a clear answer. What we get instead is an empty settlement, a carved place name, and a long stretch of silence. But if you sit with the evidence we actually have, and if you treat the colonists as people rather than characters, the story starts to feel less like a supernatural puzzle and more like a human problem with a human kind of resolution. A fragile community is dropped into an unfamiliar environment, carrying big promises and thin supplies. The first attempt at Roanoke poisons the ground with mistrust. The second attempt arrives with families and children, with hope that is real and specific, the hope of land, of stability, of a future where your life is not crowded into someone else's rules. Then the lifeline snaps. The governor sails away to get help and gets trapped in a war that reorders priorities an ocean away. The colonists are left to do what people have always done when plans collapse and help does not come. They adapt, they compromise, they move, they attach themselves to the structures that already exist. If CROATOAN is read plainly, it is not a poetic farewell, it's a directional sign. A practical note left for someone who might still return. It suggests intention. It suggests a decision made with at least some order, even if that decision was made under pressure. That doesn't mean the colonists were safe or happy. It doesn't mean there was no violence, no loss, no fear. It means the most likely path out of the mystery is not a single dramatic event, but a series of choices made over months and years, shaped by hunger, weather, local politics, relationships, and the constant need to protect children and the sick. Roanoke's disappearance may be less about vanishing and more about being absorbed, about English settlers stepping into indigenous worlds and, in the process, becoming something else. That kind of outcome is hard to see from the perspective of the English record because the English record is not designed to track people once they stop being English in the way officials recognize. Names change, languages change, clothing and customs change. DNA can add another layer, especially when paired with careful genealogical work, but it must be handled with restraint because it's easy to overread patterns that are common to many later migrations. When all three point in the same general direction, movement away from Roanoke, contact with indigenous communities, and a blending that erases clear boundaries, the combined picture becomes more convincing than any single piece. It's not a courtroom confession, it's a convergence, and convergence is often the best you get in early colonial history. There's another modern element that doesn't get as much attention as DNA, but is just as important: the willingness to revisit old assumptions with better methods. The Roanoke story was shaped for a long time by what English sources chose to write down and what later generations wanted to believe. Modern historians and archaeologists are more likely to ask what those sources left out, what biases they carried, and what other kinds of evidence might matter. That can include indigenous oral histories and regional traditions, approached with respect and without treating them as mere clues for outsiders to extract. It can include environmental studies that reconstruct how the coastline changed and how storms and drought might have affected food security. It can include the simple but powerful act of placing Roanoke in the wider pattern of early Atlantic ventures, where failure and improvisation were common, and where survival often meant turning away from the original plan. In that sense, modern science doesn't just add gadgets to the mystery, it changes the question. Instead of asking for a dramatic ending, it asks how a community under extreme stress might restructure itself, and what kinds of traces that restructuring would leave behind. If you're hoping for a final, satisfying sentence, "They went here on this date, and this is exactly what happened," modern science probably won't give you that anytime soon, and it might never be able to. But it can do something else that's quietly powerful. It can narrow the plausible range. It can tell you which stories are likely inventions and which ones fit the messy physics of real life. It can connect a carved word on a post to a landscape you can map, a pattern you can excavate, and a human inheritance you can sometimes detect in careful, limited ways. And it can remind you that the past is not a locked room with a single key. It's more like a shoreline after a storm. You find what remains, you read the patterns, and you try to reconstruct the path people took when they walked out of sight. You need timing, lineage, and a plausible historical pathway that connects the genetics to the event. The second challenge is how ancestry spreads. Over centuries, genetic inheritance becomes diluted and shuffled. Some descendants might carry measurable segments that can be associated with certain ancestral populations, and others might not carry none at all, even if the family story is true, simply because of how recombination works. A person can be a genealogical descendant of someone and carry little to no identifiable DNA from that specific ancestor after many generations. That's not a trick, it's normal biology. So a negative DNA result doesn't necessarily disprove a family tradition, and a positive-looking result doesn't necessarily prove Roanoke. It's a tool, not a verdict. The third challenge is social history. If integration happened, it likely involved indigenous communities, and that means any genetic story is braided with indigenous ancestry as well. But indigenous ancestry is not a single category. Different communities have different histories and genetic patterns, and many have been understandably cautious about participating in genetic studies that can be misused or misunderstood. Ethical projects have to prioritize consent, transparency, and respect for how communities want their histories told. That can limit what researchers can do, but it also keeps the work grounded in real relationships instead of treating people as data mines. When people talk about DNA solving Roanoke, it can sound like a hunt. It's better to think of it as one way of listening for echoes, and even then, you have to be honest about what an echo is. Still, DNA projects have value for a different reason. They can clarify the broader landscape of settlement and mixing in the region. They can show how interconnected communities were. They can sometimes support or challenge specific lineage claims when documentary evidence is strong. And they can push back against simplistic narratives that assume populations stayed separate and unmixed. Even a careful, limited result can reinforce the idea that people moved, married, and adapted in ways that the Old English record did not capture. That in itself is aligned with the invisible solution, without pretending to put a name tag on every vanished colonist. The most responsible way to combine these modern approaches is to treat them like overlapping spotlights. The map suggests someone at some point took inland possibilities seriously, perhaps even enough to hide a symbol under a patch. Archaeology, in the right places, can sometimes reveal traces of contact or settlement that fit that inland logic, though it rarely hands you a neat label. A person can remain alive and still disappear from the paperwork of an empire. And that shift, more than any ghost story, is what makes Roanoke unsettling. It forces you to imagine the colonists not as a neat group frozen in time, but as individuals scattered across a living landscape, trying to belong, trying to eat, trying to stay out of danger, trying to keep children alive long enough that tomorrow becomes a habit again. Modern science adds texture to this picture without pretending to close it. The patched map hints that inland movement was not only possible, but perhaps anticipated. Archaeology offers scattered traces that fit contact and relocation, even if it rarely provides the clean label people crave. DNA work carries promise and limits at the same time, better at suggesting patterns than delivering courtroom certainty, and always bound by ethics, consent, and the reality that centuries blur bloodlines and identities. None of these tools gives us a single final paragraph written in 1590 explaining everything, but together they make the invisible solution feel less like a guess and more like a sober reading of what survival would have demanded. And that's where Roanoke's legacy really sits. Not in curses, not in monsters, not in the thrill of a mystery that can never be solved, but in the way it captures the true cost of early colonization. This was not a tidy project. It was improvisation under extreme conditions, driven by ambition and optimism, tangled with misunderstanding and violence, and constantly haunted by logistics that could fail at any moment. Roanoke also reminds us that the first decades of English presence in North America were not a smooth march forward. They were fragile experiments, and fragility produces outcomes that records struggle to hold. A colony can fail without a single dramatic ruin. A community can survive without leaving behind a signature that later historians can easily recognize. People can endure by letting go of the identities that brought them there. If there's a final thought worth carrying, it's this: the mystery may be less about a locked door and more about a door that opened into a different world. The colonists likely did not disappear into nowhere. They disappeared into somewhere, into relationships, into new households, into alliances and compromises that made sense on the ground. Roanoke is remembered as an empty place, but the most plausible ending is not emptiness at all. It's continuity, just not the kind that fits neatly into the story England wanted to tell about itself. Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.